Okay, so really just to kind of to kick things off, this is kind of building on our from our conversation last week that John had kind of presented a general overview of the sustainable management criteria. And so now what we're going to talk about for the next couple of weeks is we're going to talk about the specific SMCs that we kind of need to essentially establish measurable objectives, minimum thresholds, and then we'll start to talk about what is an undesirable result. Again, these are local decisions. We get to sort of work with you all to kind of develop those, but these are going to have to be included sort of in the plan. And our goal really internally is to try to get through and get some agreement on the SMCs from the larger group, and try to get that all buttoned up by the end of September. That would be ideal, because again, then that's got to get included into the plan. So I'm just going to talk a little bit, give you sort of a brief background again, very quickly on some of the concepts that John had covered yesterday, and then we'll talk about groundwater quality and subsidence. So those are 2 of the 6 that are required under SGMA. We'll talk a little bit about the concepts for MOs and MTs. I'd also like to get some feedback on perhaps what folks think are some reasonable, unreasonable conditions and undesirable results. Again, these are the unreasonable conditions are more qualitative statements, and then the undesirable results are more quantitative. So again, I'll fill you in on those details a little later on. And also, I don't know if folks have had a chance to review any of the BMPs, but there's a BMP specific to sustainable management criteria it is useful to take a look at. Our hope is that we're going to kind of provide enough background information in these presentations that you don't have to kind of go through and relearn some of these concepts. But if folks sort of want a little more time to kind of digest some of this information, there's a really good summary in some of these BMPs, and I believe, Christy, those have been shared with this group. If not, we can get those to you or post them on the website or something. So
I believe John sent them to everybody.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So again, this is more of a summary, but again, as we start to talk about sustainability, everybody sort of focuses in initially on in a lot of cases on a water budget. What is the water budget? What is the ins? What is the outs? What is the change in storage? Which can be difficult sometimes because we don't always have a monitoring network that is sort of established basin wide. So what DWR has sort of developed is they've come up with these sort of metrics, and the metrics, there's sort of 6 sort of categories. They're kind of displayed here on the screen. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to develop a monitoring network. Then we're going to essentially identify, the specific SMCs, and then we'll derive MOs and MTs and undesirable results for 5 of the 6, these metrics that are sort of displayed on the screen. As John had mentioned last week, seawater intrusion is not really an issue in this basin, so we're not going to have to address that. We'll have to have a statement in the GSP that sort of mentions it, but it's it's not an issue really. It's more sort of geared towards those basins or sub basins that are on the ocean. So we're going to focus on these 5, and then today the focus is going to be on water quality degradation and then land subsidence. And then next Tuesday we're going to focus in on groundwater levels and reduction in storage. And then Ibrahim is going to start talking initially today about depletion of surface water. And then that conversation is going to continue for a couple of weeks. I think this is probably the depletion of surface water is probably the most complicated SMC. A lot of times we don't have the monitoring network in place to sort of really assess it. So again, I think this is the one that's going to be primarily the focus in this basin. So. Again, this slide was kind of presented. It kind of gives you sort of an overview of where we're headed. So I mentioned these undesirable conditions, and again, this is sort of a qualitative statement that will help. We'll provide some examples, and eventually that'll have to be included in the GSP. So as an example, if you're talking about subsidence, a qualitative statement might look like, we want to operate the groundwater levels or the aquifer in a way that doesn't, induce subsidence that impacts, roads, wells, those kind of things. So it's really a qualitative statement. And then we'll get into the sustainable management criteria. I'm going to throw these acronyms around. I'm going to try to give you enough information or background so you when I start mentioning MOs and MTs, you know what I'm referencing. So we got the measurable objectives. Again, that's sort of the goal. That's where we want to be. The minimum thresholds, that's what we want to avoid. The minimum thresholds really how DWR is going to kind of assess our management of the basin. So again, that's where we don't want to go. And then in some cases, we'll have to have interim milestones. So fortunately, I think we're in a basin where generally the water levels are pretty healthy. So interim milestones might not necessarily be applicable because in a lot of cases, I think, in some areas we're already above the measurable objective, especially when it comes to water quality. So, but we'll work through those as we kind of move through this process. And then at some point, we need to have some discussions about what is considered an undesirable result. And like I mentioned, that's more quantitative. So, as an example, for an undesirable result for, say, water levels, it could be where water levels drop below the minimum threshold for 2 consecutive years. That would be considered an undesirable result. And then also, kind of looking through the SGMA legislation, once you hit the undesirable result, you've got to put a plan in place to get it back up above the threshold and closer to the objective. So hopefully that makes sense. If folks have questions, just, we're a small group, feel free to kind of jump in. So again, acronyms, just want to make sure everybody's sort of on the same page. So hopefully SMCs, everybody understands that's sustainable management criteria. You'll hear a lot today about MOs and MTs. I always think MO is sort of where we want to be. It's sort of the desired state. That's sort of the references the measurable objectives. And then the minimum threshold, that's the avoidance. We don't want to go there. And so that's, 2 terms that are pretty important. Interim milestones can become important. So again, if an interim milestone kind of, as the name implies, is if, let's say we were at a threshold and we wanted to get back up to the objective, we know that sometimes can happen overnight. So that interim milestone would sort of fill the gap between the threshold and the objective. And then this afternoon, you'll hear a lot about groundwater dependent ecosystems from Ibrahim. And so, he'll explain a lot of this, but on this surface water depletion, through the SGMA legislation, you have to look at all sort of water users and stakeholders and beneficial users. And sort of in the surface water depletion realm, groundwater dependent ecosystems, fish, plants, they're considered a beneficial use. So you have to address that. So I just wanted to kind of put that term out there so folks that are participating this afternoon have at least seen the acronym. So I'm going to talk a little bit about water budget. So again, the water budget is a key component to sustainable groundwater management plan. The water budget is required through SGMA. We have to develop a historical water budget, a current water budget, and a future or predicted water budget. So we're working through sort of calibrating the model now to sort of develop the historical water budget. So again, there's information that's going to come out of the water budget that's sort of which is applicable to sustainability, but I just kind of wanted to show you sort of what goes into these initial water budgets. So again, there's a lot of information on this screen. The different colors that are sort of detailed in the different in the bar graphs there, those represent essentially components that add to the water budget. As an example, net recharge, inflow, and then there's components in there that extract water from the water budget. So, domestic pumping, outflow, municipal pumping. So essentially, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but essentially anything that's sort of above the 0 line, so positive, that's adding to the water budget, and anything that's sort of below the line is subtracting from the water budget. So in an ideal world, the ins would equal the outs, so the system is balanced, or in some cases, you'd have more ins than outs. So again, this is sort of a component of the water budget. So it's kind of related to the sustainable groundwater management, the metrics in a way, but it's sort of a different piece that we have to include into the GSP, but it's not part of developing the sustainable management criteria, the 6 deadly sins, so to speak. Does that make sense to folks?
Not yet.
Okay, that's fine.
No, a quick question.
Sure.
These are actual numbers. This isn't just a theoretical demonstration here.
These are actual numbers from our current historical model. Yeah. So again, this is draft, this is not gonna, this doesn't need to end up in the front page of the newspaper, but this sort of gives you a sense of, how much water is being taken out of the basin, how much stream leakage is occurring. And again, this is sort of just very draft. It was just finished yesterday. I just wanted to kind of show you it, just sort of the general concepts. So.
And so the zero line means what?
Sure. So this is just this is the contribution. So essentially anything above the zero is adding to the water budget. So and anything below the zero is taking water out of the system. That makes sense?
Well, I guess, okay, I hear you say that, but does zero represent a specific level somewhere in this
No.
groundwater basin?
No, this is just the difference between sort of what's added to the system and what's taken out of the system. That's all it's showing. So
Hey, Eddie,
yes,
Let's see.
what's the significance of the Scott's subbasin? That's
Sure.
adding to it?
it is. So and I know this is quite controversial, but we've sort of developed this model domain that includes both. And we feel, based on what we're seeing in the water budget, there's a very small component of water that's flowing in. I mean, it's minimal. I mean, I've got the numbers somewhere. It's very, very small. You can see the light gray here. That's within the margin of error of the model itself. So it's very, very small. So.
But what's the top gray, the big chunk of it that's gray? I can't.
Yeah, outside inflow. So that's inflow that's coming from the mountains generally. So to the south, that's outside inflow from the watershed. That's
Okay.
that's the
Okay.
driver on that. So that's adding to the system. You've got a little bit from Scott's subbasin, and then we've got recharge. You see we can change the colors at some point, but you got net recharge, which sometimes is negative, sometimes is positive, but you can kind of see the orange is net recharge. And at some point we'll have another ad hoc group that we'll go into this, during a 2-hour session, so we can explain all the variables. But I just wanted to kind of show folks the concept of a water budget.
Eddie, Bethany has her hand up for a question or a comment.
Sure.
Bethany, do you still have a question?
She's muted.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So I don't know why I'm muted in both places, but yes. Okay. So my question is about the net recharge. Is that the addition of all of the things together? Like all the additions and subtractions?
That net recharge is generally from precipitation. So leakage from
Okay.
streams is an example. In some cases it's positive, some cases is negative. So I guess what I was hoping to do is just sort of illustrate some concepts. I don't want folks to kind of like, get too buried in the details, but this is sort of these are the components of the water budget that we'll share at some point with this group or a similar ad hoc.
Okay.
I don't want to
I
dismiss
mean,
your
for
question,
me
but yeah.
personally, it would be helpful if at some point in the future this comes in a net version where it's like how much is going in, how much is going out total, because it's hard to mentally map how big the bars are. Great.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that's what this graph shows.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is what this graph shows. So essentially what we're looking at here is we're looking at the storage change back through to 1987. So the sort of the purple bars, essentially, if they're below zero, show that your net storage is negative. So you're taking more water out of the system than is going back into the system. And then if you have these bars that are above zero, those are showing that your inflows are more than your outflows, right? So we know yearly that fluctuates. It happens everywhere. And then this sort of gray solid line, that's the cumulative storage change. So in DWR's eyes, what they want to see is they want to see that the cumulative storage really is never dips. It hovers around zero. That's what they want to see. So if this cumulative storage was sort of continually to decline, or worse yet, was sort of always down here below zero, that's a problem. But in this example that I'm showing here, and this is actually from the model, you're seeing your net cumulative storage is generally positive, which is a good thing. Again, it fluctuates year to year, but generally it's positive. So Bethany, does that sort of maybe address your question there?
Yep. That
Okay.
does, thank you.
Perfect. So again, we'll share more than you'll ever want to know about this at some point, but I just wanted to kind of get that out there because in a way it is related to sustainability. And, you know, looking at some of these initial water budget numbers sort of align with what we're seeing on several of the sustainability indicators, right? So if water levels were, for the most part, declining, but our water budget was showing that water levels, the storage was still positive, then there's something sort of off. So it just sort of gives us a sort of a, you know, sort of an example of making sure that things sort of, you know, feel sort of somewhat comparable.
Quick question, Eddie. When do we get a chance to dive into these numbers to see how you've arrived at them in more
Sure.
detail? In other words, what specifically did you measure or look at? So is that
Probably
for now, or is that sometime in some
Probably
other?
Probably September. You know, this is part of the modeling sort of effort. So probably in September, mid-September, we'll kind of go through some of these numbers. That sound okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That seems to me vitally important to be able to understand this in some considerable detail and evaluate it.
Exactly.
And then these peaks, I think, are really glancing very quickly. They're really significant. The high spots, 2017, that's the 16-17. That was the end of 4-year drought, and we had a huge rainfall, and
Right.
there are lots of other implications that came with that. So
Right. Yeah. So we've done it. So yeah, it's coming. This is just again just to sort of to kind of present the concept of water budgets.
okay.
So moving back to sort of monitoring well networks and SMC criteria, sustainable management criteria. I wanted to talk a little bit about the monitoring networks. So John touched on this last week, but it's really an important concept. So there's really two monitoring networks that we're kind of talking about. We've got the broader monitoring network, right? And so the graphic that's on your left there sort of illustrates all the wells that are currently being monitored in Big Valley. Okay, so we've got the broader monitoring network, but then for the sustainable management criteria and for the groundwater sustainability plan, we need to develop what they call a representative monitoring network, or an RMS. We all love, you know, acronyms. So these RMS network. So that's generally a subset of your broader monitoring network, and those are the wells where we're going to identify the MOs and MTs. And the question always comes up like, well, why don't we just make the broader monitoring network the RMS network? Well, you've got to remember, it's really expensive in a way to go out and continue to do monitoring at that detail on all the wells. And Sigma, it's got some sort of guidance documents that I'll provide that sort of gives you a sense of how do you go about establishing an RMS network. So we all realize that the current broader monitoring network is always going to happen. It's going to continue, but the RMS network is a little more refined. And also when we sort of develop the RMS network, you know, we really need to understand not only the well construction information, but we want to have wells that have a historical record. So wells that only have sort of 2 to 3 years worth of water levels doesn't really give us a representation of what's happened historically. So that's another reason we like to sort of look at the RMS wells that have a longer sort of record. So I just kind of wanted to point that out and let you know that we're talking about two networks. We're not going to give up on the broader monitoring network, but you know, as far as the GSP goes, we're going to have to develop these RMS wells or this RMS network. Is that clear for folks?
Yeah. One quick, sorry, Eddie, keep
Yeah, no, this is great. This is what we want.
Okay. I'm just so puzzled about that one well that is described as as the monitoring network that is south of the town of Kelseyville, south of highway. Yes, that one.
Okay.
That really puzzles me because that is outside what you would ordinarily consider to be the area where you're pumping groundwater.
Sure.
And how is it? Where is it precisely, and how is it chosen? Because that's very much of a channel. There's surface flow there when it gets down to the Main Street Bridge and then disappears underground. That's an odd one to me.
And I know you've asked for a KMZ file of all these wells, and we're going to get those to you so we can dive into those details. And Peter, nothing's been decided. If we think, you know what, we don't want to use that, we want to use another well, that's fine. We just know that this particular well had a pretty good historical record.
Okay,
and we had pretty good well construction information on it. But I mean, if
Okay.
folks think that's not the right well, it's not too late to change it. That's fine.
well, it's certainly upstream of any pumping that's going on down in the valley, including municipal pumping. And so that part is significant. But
Okay.
anyway, it's
Yeah,
just a
we'll-
puzzling location to me because I know that stream well. So,
Yeah, we'll address it. Yeah, so we'll look at that. So
okay.
that's sort of an update on the RMS wells. I did mention this on the previous slide, but we want to make sure that we've got sort of an adequate density of RMS wells. And we want to make sure that we really understand the well construction information. And also we have a decent historical record. That's really important. So I just wanted to kind of, touch on that again. I think I
Sure.
mentioned it.
Eddie, and before you depart from that, Ingrid has her hand up, and I think she has a question or a comment.
Sure.
Yeah, hi everyone. I do have a quick question. So I see that you have selected 4 RMS sites. Is it only 4? Is that right?
There's going to be 6. Well, we're still between 6 and 8 is what we're looking at. I got a better map here that has more details. There's between 6 to 8 RMS wells.
That's good.
Right. And you want to use the 6 to 8 for water quality, groundwater levels, and all the criteria?
Correct. That's ideally what we want to do. Yes.
Okay. Probably you touch on it further, but I know that there should be some priority for wells that like domestic wells. So I'm wondering if any of this among the 6 to 8 is located near domestic wells.
I think some of them are actually domestic wells, right? William? I think some of them are domestic wells.
Yeah, some of them are. I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, but actually it's probably split 50-50.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Right. And I think, for the purposes of the GSP, we want to develop a network that is representative of the entire subbasin or the basin, and also represents the various stakeholders, right? So we have to be really, really careful and make sure that we feel like it's not equitable, but it represents all the stakeholders. So that's one of another challenge, and we will do that. So again, if folks want to add wells, get rid of wells, change well locations, we're, as long as we've got the historical record and understand the well completion information, and can get the access agreement set up to go out and do the monitoring, we can do that. So
Bethany, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to know when the selection, in what meetings is the selection of RMS wells going to occur? And then my second question was about, so you said that they should have a long period of record, but last meeting we talked about, well, 2015 is kind of the cutoff and we're going to be managing going forward. So what would be the importance put on the long historical record if we could find something that's better located, according to us, that provides more information going forward? So we can use those wells where it's like they provide the historical information, but where do we monitor it going forward? Seems like it could be another set or another tweaking of those.
yeah, and so typically what we like to see is at least a 10-year historical record on our water levels. Because when we start talking about MOs and MTs, we want to make sure in this particular basin, it's actually really easy to do on the water quality side and the water level side, but we want to make sure that we're including like the dry periods, wet periods. We want to make sure we pick up on those different climatic changes. So if we just look at 2015 data forward, we're kind of skewing that data compared to looking at sort of the overall historical record, where we do want to pick up on the wet periods and dry periods. So that's the reason why
Right.
we want to have something that's got a sort of a longer record, if we can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
For setting the standards, but then, so you have to, wherever you set the standards, you have to collect the data from those particular locations, is what you're saying?
well, that's ideal, but in a lot of times what we'll do is let's say, we've got this well location that's got a great historical record, and then but we've got a better location clear nearby, or there's another reason for it. What we would do is because we're going to continue to monitor the larger program, And then at some point, you know, if the trends look similar, we could convert over and use that additional well or add that to the
Gotcha.
RMS network. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. And then
yeah.
when is the selection happening for the RMS? When are we actually talking about that?
So yeah, so we're talking about it today, just to kind of the concepts out there. And my hope is that, you know, folks will come up with some questions, and then I'll go back, kind of, you know, pull that information together. And then a similar presentation is going to be given next week at the GSPAC. And so my hope is, you know, we can get some agreement on the number of wells and the actual location of those wells by next Friday. That's my hope. But again, this is your plan. You guys are in charge. You just let me know what you feel comfortable with, you know, but we do need, you know, we can't finish the SMC chapter until we've selected the RMS wells. So whenever this group feels comfortable giving us that list, that's what we'll go with. So ideally, we'd like to get that sort of developed sooner rather than later. Does that address your question?
Yep. Thank
Okay.
you.
When you tell us it's ready, that's when we'll have it ready. No, I'm just kidding.
Hey, Eddie, I'd just like to chime in too that that part about getting the access agreements is also a really important part of this, because a lot of the wells in the basin are owned by people that don't live inside the basin. And so contacting them and actually getting those access agreements is at times quite difficult. So.
So I'm going to keep plugging ahead here, or plotting ahead. So, you know, when sort of making some decisions on how many wells that need to be included in the RMS network, you know, there's some guidance documents out there. This is sort of a table that's from one of the BMPs that I referenced earlier, I think in the second slide. So there's a lot of information, but essentially these are sort of recommendations based on sort of the size of the basin or the subbasin, recommendations based on how much pumping is occurring within the basin or subbasin. So you can kind of see, if you look at this table, there's various sort of estimates, but essentially this is how many wells per 100 square miles. So really, Big Valley is about 30 square miles. Okay, so you get a sense of if you had a basin that was 100 square miles, or in this case, just sort of maybe sort of visualize it, let's assume it's 50 square miles, then you could just take these numbers and cut them in half. But really, we're looking at anywhere from, you know, 2 to 5 wells would probably meet the minimum requirements, sort of based on this best sort of this BMP that DWR had put together for a basin the size of Big Valley. So that's where we came up with that 6 to 8 number. And so again, nothing's been decided, but it's about one well represents about 5 square miles. That's kind of how we've come up with it. And then to give you sort of a sense of, you know, how much pumping is occurring in the subbasin, it's you know, it's more than 10,000. If I'll just kind of go back to this graphic here, you can kind of see, if you kind of had to estimate pumping, you know, municipal and ag pumping is, you know, probably, you know, in some cases it's, you know, in that 5 to 10,000 acre feet a year range. So that's why we felt, well, let's come up with that 6 to 8. And again, we can adjust it if need be, as long as we feel like we've got a pretty good understanding of the well construction, and we want to have, you know, a decent historical
get
record. So. I think somebody was talking to the dog. Maybe they were talking to me. I don't know. That's okay. I've got thick skin. So anyway, that's sort of a guidance doc, just to kind of give you a sense of, you know, hey, is it realistic to have, you know, these 5 to 8 wells or 6 to 8 wells? We feel like it is. It gives us a pretty good density. And again, if others have other ideas, we're happy to listen. So that's kind of the process we're going through right now. Again, nothing's been decided, but this is our 6 to 8 is sort of our goal. So this is just the same map, but we just kind of, I just sort of created it's a little easier to review, and we'll get some KMZ files at some point and get those out to folks. And again, we've got pretty good historical records and well construction information on the wells that are essentially with the sort of blue X's through them. But again, we can shift some of these around. It's not too late. So that's a little bit about the network.
Hey,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, or maybe a comment, like what would be helpful, I think, for me going forward is when we're trying to figure out where these wells should be, is maybe the base map where it has the changes in groundwater elevations over time from, I think, chapter 2 or something like that, just to see what's the long-term average in these areas, basically.
Sure. Yeah. And we've got that. Yeah, we can put that together, but we've also, for each one of these locations, we're going to talk about MOs and MTs, and we're going to show you a hydrograph so you can actually see what the water level looked like at this well, going back as far as we have. So we'll have that record. So we can do both. That's fine. So. So let's just talk a little bit. I'm going to continue to talk about the network. And again, we're talking more about water quality right now. So our focus today is on water quality and subsidence. So when it comes to water quality, there is some information out there, but there's not a lot that we were able to sort of derive off of the wells that we sort of proposing in our RMS network. We've got a pretty good historical water level record, but we don't really have a great historical water quality data record. So the wells that we've kind of outlined in red were a couple of wells where we thought we had pretty good historical records on water quality. So as we start to talk about establishing SMCs for water quality, we need to look at historically what the water quality's been, because we need to set an MO and MT for each specific well. So I just, we're struggling a little bit with that. I know William has been working with DWR. They've gone out and done some recent sampling on some of these wells, or at least in the general area of these these locations. So we'll have a more current view of what water quality looks like, but we don't have a great historical record on water quality. So, and really what we want is we want the wells that have a good historical water level record to really be the same wells that we monitor for water quality, because as you can imagine, if water levels start to change, we want to see, do we see that change in water quality? Do we see that change in subsidence? Those. So we want, in an ideal situation, the same well will be utilized for all of the SMCs. Doesn't always work out that way, but it's really good to have that comparison with water levels and water quality. So this is just another map, and you can kind of see that the wells that have little red dots on them, these were wells that DWR had gone out and sampled about a couple of weeks ago. We actually had asked for quite a long list. So we're hoping that data comes back here in the next couple of weeks, and we'll take a look at that and just sort of see, does anything, any metals or nitrates kind of pop up that sort of maybe allows us to kind of maybe rethink the direction that we're kind of going on, sort of selecting a list of analytes that we want to sort of set MOs and MTs on. So again, that data it should be here by the end of the month. So we'll report that out to maybe a GSPAC at some point, so folks can kind of see, hey, here's what the water quality looks like today at these specific locations. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. And that's a grant that William got through DWR to help support that. So that was good that they're doing it. So let's talk about sort of, some ideas on water quality parameters. And so typically in these groundwater sustainability plans, again, we've got the larger monitoring network, which we can at some point include additional water quality parameters to measure, but we've got to set the MOs and MTs for specific water quality parameters. So when we started kind of digging into the data a little bit, there were a couple of things that kind of popped out at us, and it was arsenic, boron, nitrate, and total dissolved solids. Those were kind of the three that we thought, well, that might give us sort of a general indication and of sort of the overall water quality health of the aquifers. Again, this is sort of a, we don't have the resources to go out and collect full Title 22 every year at these well locations. So we're trying to find one or two water quality parameters that would be sort of a generally an indicator for the overall health of the aquifer. So we'll talk a little bit about these 3 or 4, and again, we can, as always, have discussions about other ideas. But so arsenic, boron, nitrate, total dissolved solids. So regarding arsenic, this is sort of the water quality sort of concentration. So this is sort of the MCL that's set by the state. So, you know, in a municipal setting, you can't have arsenic in that well that's greater than 0.01 milligrams per liter. So, you know, 10 ppm, sorry. So that's sort of the metric. And so here's sort of the range that we're able to find of concentrations of arsenic in the, you know, within your area. So there were a couple that popped up that were above the MCL, but those were, that was older data. So again, that sort of gives you a sense of what arsenic concentrations look like. So regarding arsenic, you know, for the current monitoring network, we were only able to find really 2 wells that had any recent arsenic concentration data. And you can kind of see on this graphic, hopefully, maybe you can see my cursor, 10 micrograms per liter, so 10 ppb is the MCL. So if you were in, you know, Kelseyville and you had water quality that was above 10 ppb, you'd have to implement some kind of treatment to get that water below 10 ppb. But we're not seeing it in the RMS well. So generally, the concentration of arsenic have been really, really low, like not below the detection limit, but below the MCL. So that was just sort of a snapshot of what arsenics looked like in a couple of these wells where there was data available. Next one we looked at is boron. So yeah, somebody have a question?
Yeah. So I'm just looking at these water quality parameters, and I just wanted to make the point, because I worked in water quality, that whatever you're asking for measurements of, to make sure that the method detection limit is below the MCL.
Correct.
So, so you don't just putting a note out there, because I've seen it happen where the MCL is lower than the actual detection limit for the test that was requested.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. And you can see both of these wells are from production wells in Kelseyville. So you can see that the MCL is 10. I'm guessing that the reporting limit or the detection limit is obviously less than 10, but you can see they're detecting down below, you know, 5 parts per billion. So I think in this example, they're obviously meeting that criteria, but it's a good point.
Peter, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. You use the term the health of the water,
Mhm.
and I want to ascertain whether that implies that it could be unhealthy, but I don't know if you're meaning just in the natural occurrence of things, it's less suitable for human consumption. For example, boron, I mean, that's naturally occurring in the system. Are you suggesting that if it's unhealthy, it's somehow being introduced into the system?
No. So it's not anthropogenic. It's just like, you know, like the water quality in Big Valley is all generally, at least for boron, arsenic, that's natural, that's background. There's nothing, you know, there's nothing the humans can do to sort of have an effect on those 2 concentrations. So I guess when I say health, I just mean, is it healthy to drink is maybe a better word to say.
All right. I think that's important, because and even true in terms of nitrates. And by the way, there's another one that's really important in this area, at least in ag, is magnesium.
Sure.
And that's a pretty high in some areas, particularly over in the Adobe Creek area.
Right. But there's nothing we can do as a user to control that, right? That's sort of natural.
I understand that, but I just wanted to make sure I was clear about that. If you're talking about unhealthy, it means unhealthy for humans to drink, not because it's not unhealthy because of something humans have done.
No, exactly. Yeah. And in fact, there's not any large contaminated plumes that were created by humans. So that's a benefit for us in this system. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So boron, again, we did find some historical boron concentrations, but none of those were on our proposed RMS monitoring network. That means it's not necessarily not there, but we're not picking it up in the RMS wells. But we do know it exists. But again, it exists in wells that maybe don't have the historical water level and or water quality network. And sometimes the construction information is not well known. So it's just an example of boron. Nitrates, we do see nitrates. Again, the sort of the MCL sort of set by the state for nitrate is 10. We've seen values that sort of range from 0.02 up to about 65 or 70 milligrams per liter. And so what we do now is we start looking at, our RMS wells. And again, both of these current wells are the production wells at Kelseyville. We're not seeing nitrate concentrations above the MCL. So again, it just sort of gives you a sense of, hey, arsenic, boron, nitrate, we're not seeing those water quality parameters above the MCL. And we're trying to come up with a parameter to set for our water quality SMC. So, so far from what we're seeing is, arsenic, boron, nitrate are not anywhere close to the MCL. And so those are sort of three that we're thinking, well, maybe those don't really fit, into sort of establishing an MO and an MT. So anyway, that's just a sort of a snapshot of nitrate specific to the proposed RMS well network. So then we get to total dissolved solids. So total dissolved solids really sort of gives you sort of a general indicator of the water quality. So it's not a specific parameter or variable. It's just sort of an indicator of the general water quality of the system or from the aquifer. And a lot of these GSPs, electrical conductivity or TDS are generally utilized for the water quality parameter specific for establishing the water quality SMC. So, water quality concentrations for total dissolved solids, there's not a primary MCL, there's a secondary MCL. So a secondary MCL is sort of a recommended limit by the regional board. So it's not enforceable, but I just kind of wanted to put that out there. So really the water quality concentrations in Big Valley, the range that we noticed were anywhere from about 100 up to about 800. So we thought, okay, let's sort of look at this parameter and sort of see what the water quality parameters look like in some of these wells. So again, we sort of selected a couple of these RMS wells that had, in some cases, we don't have a great record of TDS, but again, we're kind of hoping to supplement that with some of this recent sampling, but you can kind of get a sense of what the TDS concentrations have looked like, in these particular wells. I think going back to, I think we've got some back to 95-ish. Yeah, so you can kind of see right now in this general area, TDS is below 200. In these general areas, it's hovering about 200. So the thought was, well, we've got a somewhat recent record of TDS in these areas. Perhaps, TDS could be utilized as the SMC criteria for specific to water quality. So that's sort of TDS.
I'm sorry, quick question. Are you
Yeah,
using the Kelseyville municipal wells for
We are.
this testing? I'm sorry.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Okay, I assume they're probably more testing there than any place else. So.
Yeah, they're required to do it, so it's kind of helpful to have that information,
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah. Okay, so the thought would be, again, nothing's been decided, but we said, oh, well, we know that through the state they've got sort of drinking water requirements. I mentioned TDS. There's a secondary enforcement value of about 500. So their recommended is to keep it, at or below 500 milligrams per liter. And then they've got some sort of refinements on the upper, and then there's some short-term limits. So, it's not uncommon for TDS, an MO for TDS to be set at 500. We could set it lower than that, but it gives us sort of an indication again of the general water quality in the system. I mentioned specific conductance. Sometimes folks use specific conductance. Chloride sometimes can be used. Sulfate can sometimes be used. I would probably stay away from chloride and sulfate and focus more on conductance or TDS, just because of some of the geothermal systems with sulfate can sort of elevate this. And keep in mind, if we have challenges with water quality, we've got to put a management action in place to fix that challenge, right? So again, we have to be really careful on which parameter we set for the water quality SMC. So what I thought about here, and again, nothing's been decided, I kind of wanted to present some general concepts. So we talked a little bit about sort of developing some sort of significant and unreasonable statements we've got to make some decisions at some point, not today, about what the MO and MT would look like, specific to water quality. And then also we have to sort of refine and develop an undesirable result. So again, just as an example, what could a significant and unreasonable statement look like for water quality? If we utilize TDS, we could do arsenic, we could do boron, we could do other parameters, but essentially what it could look like is, and these are just two examples, we could utilize TDS as a proxy for groundwater quality that no longer meets the 2020 DW standards established at 500 milligrams per liter for the intended beneficial use at majority of the representative monitoring wells due to groundwater conditions or land use. Or another statement could be something like a result stemming from a causal nexus between sigma-related groundwater quantity management activities and groundwater quality that causes significant and unreasonable reduction in the long-term viability of domestic, agriculture, municipal, or environmental uses over the planning and implementation horizon of the GSP. So at some point, we kind of need to agree on the language. We don't today, but these are sort of some example unreasonable statements that we've developed for other GSPs. So again, that's not that important today, but really what I think is important just to get these concepts across. So moving through and talking about MOs and MTs, one idea could be, we know that the sort of secondary drinking water quality parameter for TDS is 500 milligrams per liter. You could set the MO at 500 milligrams per liter. And then the threshold, again, the threshold is what we want to avoid. That could be set at something greater than the MO, right? Or there could be a decision that we want to keep our MO below 500 milligrams per liter and set the MT at 500. So there's some flexibility there. And again, at some point we need to make these decisions, but I just wanted to sort of present those concepts to you. And then another concept, and I'll kind of I'll go to one more slide and we can open it for some discussion. We have to figure out what an undesirable result is. So, once we hit the threshold, hopefully we never hit the threshold, we have to develop an undesirable result statement. So what is considered undesirable? So as an example, let's assume we had a well and we chose TDS as the the water quality parameter, and let's say it hit 750 milligrams per liter. Is that considered undesirable? Or do we want to say, well, we could have it occur, it's only considered undesirable if that MT is hit at 50% of the RMS wells and it is exceeded for two consecutive years. So again, there's some flexibility on that, but at some point we need to make a decision on what that undesirable statement is going to be. Another sort of option can be, it's the last bullet on this slide, is when 25% of the wells above the MT for the same constituent TDS based on the average of the most recent 3-year period. So again, realizing we need to manage to the MO, to the MT and the MO, we need to come up with some statements at some point that kind of, address what we considered undesirable.
Eddie, I have two folks with their hands up. So I did not see who's one up first. So I'll just, Brenna, yours first on my screen here. So we'll go with Brenna, and then Bethany, you'll be second.
Thanks, Christy. So Eddie, I have just a quick clarifying question, and then I have a comment.
Sure.
Back when we were discussing nitrate, boron, and arsenic, you had mentioned that those might not necessarily be the constituents that we choose in kind of our limited range of monitoring. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct.
Okay.
If we decide to utilize the same RMS network for water levels, we don't really have a great historical record of boron. Nitrate's okay, or arsenic. So.
Okay, I guess my comment is I would make a plug for the continuing monitoring of nitrate, just because it's such a large component of other regulatory efforts, and having that long-term data set available is going to be really valuable long-term, not just for the groundwater sustainability in Big Valley, but for irrigated lands and other kind of ag-specific regulatory efforts that are going on. So that's my plug. I mean, arsenic and boron, maybe there's other constituents we want to use, but I would advocate that we keep nitrate in there, just because of its importance in a lot of other arenas.
Sure, and I think there's a couple of ways to do that. That could be included as part of the RMS network, or it could be included as part of the larger network where you would sort of incorporate that nitrate nitrate sampling. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. We just have to at some point agree on what the MO and the MT would be for nitrate. So, but yeah, I'm not opposed to that. So.
Bethany, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there any reason why bacteria indicators were ruled out as a possibility in monitoring these wells? I understand that there are septic systems and things in the area along with municipal well use. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've never heard of. I mean, it's you know, a lot of these like other constituents, nitrate, bacteria are monitored as part of other programs, like, you know, regulatory programs. But what we're trying to do is sort of develop a sort of a metric that gives us a sense of the general health of the aquifer. I think if we got into monitoring for bacteria, I think one of the questions I would probably get posed from some folks would be, well, is the bacteria a result of, like, you know, the well's not constructed right, doesn't have the right sanitary seal. If the septic system was installed too close to the well, you know, that's sort of a regulatory issue, not a sustainable groundwater management issue. So that would be sort of my initial response back. But if folks think it's important, we could look at it. We just need to make sure we've got the historical record to set the MO and the MT. So.
I mean, wouldn't the MO and the MT, if you didn't have an historical record of it, be set by the regulatory framework that says, yeah, you can't have it at some concentration in drinking water, or based on the beneficial uses?
It could be, but that's you know, we got to make sure that, no, we're not regulating the bacteria. We're just trying to set a metric that helps sort of understand the beneficial management of the system. So I would not set an MO and MT unless we have some historical record, because if let's say, as an example, the bacteria question, if that bacteria has been in that well since 1965, you know, and we set an MO that's at the MT, I mean, sorry, we set an MO that's at the, you know, the regulatory cleanup value, then the GSP is on the hook to clean that up, right? So we're not a regulatory agency, so we have to be careful. I think we need to look at what the historical record is. We can't really control what was done prior to 2015. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what you're saying makes sense, but for me, I mean, I'll have to think about it.
Sure.
More.
Yeah. But again, yeah, we're just having discussions. That's sort of my initial thought. But if folks think it's important, then we can look at that. We just got to really be careful that we've got a historical record. So, because if, you know, what we've seen in some areas is, if, you know, if we have values of a specific constituent that was above, you know, another regulatory agency's MCL, then we have to be careful how we incorporate that into sort of our plan, because, you know, once the MOs and MTs are set, I think it's gonna be very difficult to sort of change those down the road. So. Any more questions, Christine?
Do not see any other hands raised.
Okay. Just check the time here. Yeah, we're doing good. So, all right, so let's just kind of bring this in. And again, this is good discussions, but essentially what we have to do at some point in the not too distant future is, once we sort of develop the RMS network, then we have to have discussions about setting the MOs and MTs for whatever parameters we sort of decide upon. So this is just an example, you know, if we decided to look at TDS, setting the MO, in this case, at the secondary MCL, we can set it lower. It doesn't really matter. It's just sort of a local decision. And then the MT can be set, you know, at some value above that. And so in our cases, we know that the upper limit that's set for TDS through the state is 1,000. We didn't feel like we wanted to go that high, so we set it at 750. But again, this is just sort of concepts we're trying to illustrate. But at some point, we need to make some decisions on what the parameters would look like. So I think we just finish it. Yeah, so I think that's it for water quality. So I guess what I'm hearing is some ideas about maybe looking at including some other parameters, nitrate, I heard bacteria. What do folks think about sort of the proposed sort of density of the RMS wells? Not necessarily the exact location, but just the sort of 6 to 8. Are folks okay with that? Would you like to see more? I just wanted some general feedback on that. Too early to tell?
Go ahead and jump in, Peter.
I just pardon me. I comment that seems reasonable to me, and the way they're scattered out through the basin, I think hits the main points. So that's my comment.
Yeah, this is Brenna. I agree with Peter on that. I think 6 to 8 is reasonable, especially given their spatial distribution.
That's great. And then one other comment is, at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, we are going to sort of again try to capitalize on the resources through DWR and put in somewhere in this area a deep multi-completion well. So again, that's an example where the well goes in today, we'll continue to collect water level data and perhaps water quality data. And at some point that might be incorporated into this network. So it might expand a little bit, but that's one plan we have. So if DWR is going to help support, the installation of a well, we should take them up on it. So not sure where that's going to go yet, but we'll get some input at some point from you on it.
That's huge, and it'd be fascinating, I think, also for just the geology of the area, Clear Lake, a lot of ancillary information that would really be useful to know.
Exactly, and I think when wells are put in by engineering companies or DWR, sometimes the lithologic descriptions, there's additional geophysical testing that's done, so we can sort of pick up and refine sort of our current understanding. And so it'll be really helpful. And then perhaps looking at maybe monitoring a deeper zone and a shallower zone, because right now we're kind of looking at this as one uniform system, which we know it's not, but we don't really have the data sets to really refine it. But again, that's another benefit of these multi-completion wells, where in some cases you can have 3 individual well screens within one borehole. So it'll help us sort of understand that vertical change. So for water levels and water quality. So, okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about, and this is sort of another sort of SMC that's required, is subsidence. So fortunately, we don't see a lot of subsidence in Big Valley, but I don't know sort of where individuals are with their knowledge of subsidence. So I was going to give you a couple of slides to talk about it. We've been involved with some land subsidence work since the last decade or two. So I wanted to kind of give folks an overview and then sort of talk about some of the tools that are available to sort of understand subsidence. And as again, this is something we have to kind of develop an MO and an MT on, even though we feel like it's not really happening in this basin. We want to develop a network that kind of keeps track of it. And so I think, given the geologic framework architecture of this basin, we're probably never going to see subsidence related to groundwater extraction. That's a sort of an important term. So we know there's subsidence that occurs, earthquakes, fissures that are sort of independent of groundwater pumping. So when we're talking about monitoring for subsidence, we're relating it to groundwater extraction. There has to be a correlation between extraction and subsidence, which we don't see. And I'll walk you through some of the examples that we've kind of pulled up. So again, I don't know where folks are with their sort of general understanding of subsidence. So this little cartoon, it sort of shows you sort of pre-subsidence. This is sort of what the aquifer system would look like, pre-subsidence. And then what happens is, if there's extraction occurs primarily from groundwater pumping, what ends up happening is you remove sort of the fluid pressure in some of the pores. And as a result, that skeleton is impacted. and then things sort of collapse because you've got all this overburden that was once above the aquifer, and then you lose that structure that the water's kind of creating, and it just kind of collapses. So the graphic here is, you know, pre-subsidence, here's where land surface is, and then post-subsidence, water levels are extracted, this material collapses, and then it just kind of consolidates on top of each other. So that's the concept of subsidence. And in some cases, that subsidence can continue to occur after pumping stopped. So again, we don't see it. We see it a lot in the San Joaquin Valley, but I just want to kind of explain sort of the concepts of that. There's different types of subsidence, so that there's references to what they call elastic and inelastic subsidence. So I don't know if folks have had a chance to look at some of there's some really interesting data sets out there that the satellite imagery essentially that's flown sometimes daily, and you'll see these sort of, it's almost like the system is breathing. So you'll see land will increase, land elevation will change, not necessarily daily, but weekly, monthly, it changes a little bit. And that's sort of related to sort of barometric pressures and those kind of things, but those are really, really small levels. But generally, that's considered elastic subsidence. Inelastic subsidence is what I mentioned previously, when you sort of remove, in a lot of cases, groundwater, that aquifer can no longer retain that sort of framework, that structure, and it collapses. And once it collapses, it's almost impossible to regain that elevation. So that's referenced as inelastic or unrecoverable land subsidence. So I don't know, it's just an interesting concept, and hopefully that's somewhat clear. So again, another slide here, a lot of information going on here, but I kind of wanted to illustrate this. So you've seen this slide before where we had like sort of the pre-extraction, where land surface is up in this area, this elevation, and then we've got pumping, and then all of a sudden there's subsidence. In this case, it would be inelastic subsidence, where the land surface would actually collapse, okay? So the thought is to kind of correlate that with groundwater extraction. This sort of graphic hopefully explains it. So we've got depth to water on the y-axis, and then the x-axis is time. So essentially what you'll see water levels will decrease, and at the same time, your surface elevation will decrease. So there's a correlation between groundwater elevations decreasing and surface elevations decreasing. So you know there's some correlation between, hey, water's being removed, groundwater's dropping, and as a result, we're seeing compaction, we're seeing the surface elevation decrease as well. So that's sort of the correlation to show that subsidence is related to groundwater extraction. So, and I've got some graphics that kind of from your area that sort of don't show that correlation essentially. So, always folks sometimes ask, okay, great, we've got subsidence. What are the effects of subsidence? So there's a couple of graphics I'm kind of showing you here. This is actually a well video. I don't know if folks are familiar with it, but in a lot of cases, if you have issues with your wells, screens can get old, screens get plugged, you'll run a video in there and sort of get a sense of what things look like. So this is a well video that we did, and you can kind of see it looking at, roughly the same area. This is at 250 feet below ground surface. This is sort of when the well was brand new. And then the graphic on the left, this is actually a direct result of subsidence. So it actually crunches the well screen like an accordion because you've got that subsidence. So that's sort of damage that's caused by subsidence as a result of groundwater extraction. The photo in the middle, this is just sort of an effect from subsidence on the aqueduct. So essentially what's happened is, this is mostly in the San Joaquin Valley, you're removing groundwater, you're inducing subsidence, and then that's sort of propagating up to the surface where you're starting to see collapses along the aqueduct. And then the third slide is just, our third figure is just another example. This is sort of an extreme one out of Las Vegas, but you can see at one point, sort of where my cursor is, this is where land surface was. And then because of groundwater extraction and subsidence, now what's happened, the land has dropped, collapsed. And so now you've got these sort of damage to this. In this case, it's a pump. I think it's an electric pump. So again, it can cause issues to infrastructure primarily. Again, really common in San Joaquin Valley. We're not seeing it. This is just an example when you start asking folks about, well, how much subsidence do you see? This is kind of looking at sort of an area down in along the San Luis Canal, and so San Joaquin Valley. I mean, look at some of the subsidence value. These are, anywhere from 0 to 8 feet in settlement. So, I mean, this is going back to obviously 1967, but there is, you know, in a lot of these cases where there's heavy groundwater extraction, you're seeing sort of a lot of subsidence induced from pumping. So now hopefully you got a better sense of what subsidence is. The question now is, you know, how do we measure subsidence? And there's a couple of ways to do it. Probably the most common way is to develop sort of a GPS monitoring network where they kind of go out every once in a while and sort of survey in a specific location. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of that information in Big Valley. A lot of these areas are doing that. They used to do it, you know, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Right now, it's sort of the general trend is to utilize satellites. So this INSAR, or interferometric synthetic aperture radar, INSAR, you'll see that acronym used a lot, is essentially being utilized to measure subsidence. And so up until recently, they would do this, you know, once or twice, and they did it in 2015 and 2019. But we've been told by DWR that this is going to actually become a annual event. So the thought was, well, could we utilize the INSAR data to sort of keep track of subsidence sort of in Big Valley? So that's the thought. And I'm going to kind of walk you through some preliminary data that we got from DWR that you can kind of see where subsidence is occurring, or in this case, not occurring sort of in Big Valley. But before
Eddie,
I move,
before you do that, Brenna has her hand up. I believe she has a question.
Sorry, Brenna, I actually have two screens, so I'm trying to, so I don't mean to ignore you. I'm just trying to kind of focus in on my slides. So thanks, Christy. So.
No problem, Eddie. I just had a question on your last slide that, you know, there's generalized subsidence throughout the Central Valley, but yeah, that slide is showing very localized subsidence. Are you aware if there's been any like geospatial analysis to correlate that with either greater groundwater pumping in those areas or more confining clay layers? What's the reason for kind of that hyper localized subsidence in certain areas?
Sure. Yeah. So if I was to take this plot and overlay groundwater pumping on it, there's a correlation. So you'll see water levels are decreasing because of pumping that's inducing subsidence. So in this example, it's localized effect from pumping.
I see. So it's more on the groundwater pumping rather than the kind of that there's more variability in the subsurface lithology or presence or absence of clays.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's, you know, the lithology changes a little bit, but it's directly correlated in this area to a groundwater extraction.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So again, this INSAR data, it's been flown twice. We've been told it's gonna actually be flown yearly now. And so there's a couple of graphics here. I guess probably the most important one is the one on the right. You can kind of see this is subsidence measured at all these locations within California. And we can talk a little bit about the resolution, et cetera, later, but we know it's going to be done annually. So the thought was, and then you can sort of see Big Valleys here, that's utilize this technology. It's free, it's pretty consistent, and there's some benefits because what we can do is we can utilize the current RMS well network. We can sort of select pixels that are close to that RMS well that then can be utilized to sort of correlate extraction, water levels with subsidence. So that's a benefit of making sure that if you utilize the same monitoring location for, you know, water levels and subsidence, it kind of helps us with that correlation. So anyway, that's the thought. So this is some data. This is sort of a data set that looked at water levels and not water levels, change in groundwater elevation from 2015 to 2019, sort of in the Big Valley, Scotts Valley area. And essentially the blue area, light blue and dark blue, is really within the area of the satellite. So essentially what we're seeing here is very small, not zero, but very little vertical displacement from 2015 to September 2019. I'll kind of go back to this slide. Let's see. this is the same scale, but you can kind of see, you know, look at some of these areas where you got the red and the yellow. That was some of the graphics I was showing you earlier along the San Luis Canal, that sort of these huge subsidence areas, but we're not seeing it sort of in this area. So anyway, that's sort of the thought of maybe utilizing this technology to help with subsidence. I think the other benefit is that, you know, it gives us a sense of what the subsidence is over a larger area. I mean, for us to develop a monitoring network, you know, survey data points for this entire area would be really, really expensive. And the technology is not, you know, I mean, the technology is available to use satellites, so why not utilize the satellite data? So anyway, that's the thought. And so let me just show you a couple of graphs just so you can kind of see the correlation. So this is a particular well that's in our RMS, our proposed RMS network. And essentially the graphic you're seeing here on the left is we've got groundwater elevations, right? So the blue lines bouncing around, that's sort of, you know, how water levels change at this particular well through time. So we know seasonally water levels change. So in this case, we're seeing 20, 30 feet of water level changes seasonally. And then this green line that you see, if you can kind of see it, this is actually what the surface elevation looks like from the satellite data at that particular location. So look at the scale is much different. So this is the vertical displacement from the INSAR data at the surface elevation. So it's very, very small. I mean, it's that this 0.05 is actually within the error of the satellite imagery. And so you can kind of see, you know, we don't see any correlation, real correlation between water level fluctuations and subsidence in this particular example. So this is just a way that we can utilize that tool to sort of, you know, develop our MOs and MTs for subsidence. So that's one example of a well. Here's another one, you know, over here, but again, you see water levels are bouncing around, but we don't see a correlation, you know. In fact, this is an example where water levels are going up, but we're seeing really, really slight decreases in subsidence, so, or increases in subsidence. So again, there's no real correlation, but it's a way that we can kind of keep track of water levels and subsidence at those areas. Again, the vertical displacement is really, really small. I think I've got a couple more. Here's another example. I think this is the well, Peter, we were going to talk about, but you can kind of see it's almost like there's an inverse, right? So we don't see a correlation between water level changes and subsidence. And also note that, you know, we see, you know, yes, subsidence is occurring. We see it kind of bounce down here at 0.05 feet, but then sometimes you see it rebound. So this is the elastic subsidence I was talking about. So we do know that things will change sort of slightly, but we're seeing it bounce around. It's not seeing this a constant decrease. You know, we don't see a constant decrease in that. So here's another one, although we do see a decrease in this one, but we're starting to see it recover, see how it recovers. So that's the elastic subsidence. So anyway, that's the thought on utilizing the INSAR data to help with subsidence.
Bethany, did you have a question or a comment, Freddie?
Yeah, I'm seeing lots of points of information on the vertical displacement, and I thought the INSAR data was taken maybe a couple of times since 2015, and there's one more coming. So could you explain to me how you're getting so many data points?
Yeah, so it's a comparison. So I think this is just the way the graphic was developed. My understanding is that this is monthly data. So you're just looking at the monthly change from 15 to 19. So it's actually monthly data they're collecting. That makes sense?
Oh, so DWR is collecting monthly data, but then they're only supplying the vertical displacement on a biannual or so basis or something?
No, they ran the satellite. My understanding is they ran the satellite from June 15 continuously through September 19, where they collected monthly readings. And then that program, I think, was only flown through those two periods from 15 to 19. But now I've heard they're going to start flying it every year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just sort of a thought on MOs and MTs on subsidence. So again, sort of similar to on water quality, you know, what do we want to do about sort of setting MTs and MOs for subsidence? So recognizing that the error in the INSAR data is about 0.1 feet per year. So that's essentially our detection limit with this sort of approach. The decision could be made, well, we don't want to have any subsidence, again, directly correlated to groundwater extraction. So the MO and MT, you can't really set it at 0 because you're limited with the data. So typically what we've seen and what we've helped in other areas is we know the subsidence is the error is about 0.1 foot per year. So if you said, hey, over a 5-year period, we don't want to see any more than half a foot of subsidence. That's kind of the 0.5 feet of subsidence. That's sort of a typical approach on setting MOs and MTs for subsidence. And again, inelastic subsidence. Elastic is going to occur. So that's just an idea. But I think we could all agree we don't want to see any subsidence directly related to groundwater extraction, which we haven't seen, historically. So talking a little bit about, what would a sort of a general significant or unreasonable sort of statement look like? So again, we can make these decisions at some point down into the future, but we don't want to cause any infrastructure issues. Like I showed the canal where subsidence had caused some concrete to crack. I don't know of any issues related to like that in Big Valley. Increased flooding, again, because of subsidence. I've never seen it, never read anything about it. What is also maybe considered significant and unreasonable, any land subsidence caused by lowering of groundwater levels occurring in the basin. I kind of mentioned that previously. And then another sort of example is groundwater conditions in the subbasin result in permanent inelastic subsidence due to a degree that disrupts or causes accelerated damage to important public or private infrastructure, roads, rails, bridges, those kind of things. So that's just, again, a sort of more of a qualitative statement. An MO and MT, we have to set one at some point. So again, recognizing that the error in the technology or in the analysis is about 0.1 foot per year. A lot of times I mentioned previously, an MT could be set at, okay, we don't want to see more than 0.5 feet over a 5-year period, which equates to about 2 feet over 20 years. And then the MO, in some cases, I've seen the MO and the MT set the same. Some folks have said that they think the accuracy of this software or this technology might improve. So they take essentially the current error and keep it, try to reduce that by half. So in this case, instead of, 0.5 foot per year, they look at 0.25, which obviously can't be measured at this point. And then also at some point we need to develop sort of what is considered undesirable to this group. And it can be something similar where we don't want to see the MT drop below we don't want the MT to decrease in more than 50% of the groundwater wells. So again, we don't need to make those decisions today. I just kind of want to get that on the table, but at some point, probably next Friday, we need to have some conversations with the larger group. And I think at some point, Christy, keep me honest here, we've got to get that to the board for their approval. So we're looking for a recommendation, probably maybe next week on some of those decisions. So so it's about 12:30. I think that's really all I had. I know it was a lot of information. Hopefully it kind of provided you with a pretty good sort of at least baseline understanding specific to water quality and subsidence. I guess I would be interested in some sort of initial feedback on the subsidence, sort of the approach, utilizing satellite imagery. I'm not sure what other choice we have right now. Unless we could sort of decide to develop a subsidence GPS monitoring station, but again, then we don't really have the historical record. So yeah, I guess just with that, I'll just open it up for questions. What do folks think about the INSAR technology? Maybe the setting the MOs and MTs at the sort of the accuracy of the technology. Okay, what do folks think about that?
Renee, go ahead.
Thanks, Christy. So yeah, I think everything you've laid out seems really reasonable. It seems like the method of data collection that's fairly standard for measuring subsidence around the state. So it seems like we should be consistent and use the same methodology. I think your point on the creating MOs and MTs with the keeping that I'm sorry. Keeping the 0.1 feet, margin of error in mind, I think that's a good idea too. So your suggested MOs and MTs make sense in that line.
Great, thanks. I guess one question I guess one question would be, so, next week we have our GSPAC meeting, where some of this information is going to be provided or presented. So it's going to be essentially, I think the introduction to SMCs is not going to probably be presented, maybe a high level, but then we've got to cover, subsidence, water quality. I don't think any decisions are going to have to be made on the surface water depletion. Next Tuesday, I think we're going to talk more about water levels and sort of change in storage. So there's a lot of information that has to be covered at the GSPAC meeting. I don't know, Christy, could we estimate how long you think we'd have next Friday scheduled for those 3 or 4 topics? You think in
We
an hour?
have a really, really full schedule, but we can, dedicate the bulk of it. I think some of the other items that we have could probably be offloaded to just some email updates and reviews and things like that, but it'll be the bulk of the meeting. Okay. So I guess I'm looking for maybe, because we've got to kind of disseminate this information to the larger group. I hate giving homework assignments. We want, we've got folks engaged for 2 hours next Friday. Does this group think we could sort of make some decisions on MOs and MTs and maybe even undesirable results specific to water quality and subsidence, just kind of based on what you've heard today? Is there additional information that perhaps Christy's not going to like the word additional information I need to present, but is there anything else that would be helpful? And point of clarification, Eddie, you're asking for, is there anything that we might need for next Friday's discussion?
Correct,
so that we can make recommendations out of that group, because it will be the full group that will need to make recommendations. But anything that's discovered here can be offered as guidance or just background information for the larger group as a whole.
Correct. Yeah.
Christy.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah. Can we say to the larger group, this group has looked at this? We certainly don't want to walk through this whole thing again, because it seems to me totally non-controversial, very straightforward. Satellites flying over every year. How can you do better than that? So can we say this group has looked at it and give it 2 minutes next Friday and say it's non-controversial and we would recommend it be included?
Sure.
So we go on to things that are much more significant, would be my that are bigger issues.
Yeah, where we definitely need to be careful of conveying information is making sure that that there's no recommendations that are made out of this particular one, that it's just guidance or just that the review has been done of that information. And then also they will get access to this full deck and the recording as well. So they will have the opportunity to visit that if they want to.
But that's fine. Anyway, as little time as can be spent would seem to me to make sense, because there are the things that are just so more important. And by the way, where we can find this would be helpful too. On the still not clear to me where I find all of that we've been doing on a website. So
as far as the presentation slides, Peter?
Yes.
Okay, I will put up the landing page that people can access it, and generally it's put up within like a day or two after we are done and we close it out. The recording takes a little time to render and then we post it on there. William posts it on there. He's very, very good about updating things, but I will put in the chat, I will put the landing page where people can find the items.
Thank you.
Okay, that's really helpful. Do others have some questions, concerns, ideas that maybe could help facilitate the meeting next Friday?
typically the water quality and subsidence are generally the easier SMCs to kind of get some agreement on. The others will be more complicated, so. Okay. So Christy, that's all I really have. I think I've got some assignments I need to dig into a little bit more. This slide deck, we'll get that to you all at some point. Is there anything else that we can talk about here? We got about half an hour left, or some clarifications or other issues related to RMS, well network, and water quality subsidence? Okay, hearing none, I think we're done. So thanks for your time. And William, are you good to go?
Yes, sir.
All righty.
And for anybody who has nothing to do this afternoon and wasn't already planning on it, we will be doing the GDE subcommittee meeting from 3 to 4:30. And there's also a public meeting tonight too, from 5:30 to 7, that will just be going over some general, what is the GSP and communication and engagement, and then also talking a little bit about just domestic wells in terms of, helping people, educate people on what domestic wells are in Lake County. So.
Great. Well, thank you. Hopefully this was helpful. It was really helpful. Thanks for your feedback, and we'll keep chugging.
Thanks, Eddie.
All right. Take care. Thank you.